Welcome back. Tonight we're talking about sickle cell anemia, and one of the questions, I know you were asking a question, Lab, but we'll come to that in a bit about the attacks. I think that's what you mentioned. I want to talk a little bit about the misconception that sickle cell anemia is only found in certain parts, let's take Kenya, but certain parts of Kenya, at the coast or in Western Kenya. How true is this in terms of the cases being more predominant in some counties than others?
I think let me mention this, Janet, from the beginning, that sickle cell disease or sickle cell disorder is a global disorder. We find sickle cell anemia in the US because of the migration that happened during the slavery time. You got the UK number of them. But if you look at the total number of people, for example, if we look sickle cell anemia, if you picked UK and the US, they contribute on it 1%. 75% of sickle cell anemia patients are found in the African continent. Now, in this country, we see a lot of sickle cell patients in Nyanza region, in Western Kenya. When we talk about Nyanza up to Nyamira region, because sometimes I find patients from there who say in Nyamira there isn't, all those areas, and at the coast. At the coast, the Mijikenda, there's a lot in there. But because of this inter-ethnic communication, you have a boyfriend, you have a girlfriend, and you have a baby, but you don't get married. We find this gene in Central Province, in Nairobi is there.
Oh, because of people. We'll just move a bit quickly, but why is it more
in those areas?
In those areas, yeah.
In those areas, what the relationship between sickle cell anemia and Nyanza and Western is this concept about malaria. If you live in an area where there's malaria and there's a sickle cell gene, the people who are normal, who we refer to as AA, people who are normal and they don't have the gene and they don't have sickle cell anemia, tend to be susceptible to malaria. So malaria will actually possibly kill a number of them. And the patients with sickle cell anemia, like Leah here, again, when they get the disease, they have malaria, it's quite severe in them. But these people who carry the gene tend to have some resistance. So if you go to those areas like Western and Nyanza and you're looking for a wife or a husband, the chance that the person you find living is a carrier is very high.
And it seems to be more prevalent against black people generally. If you say 75% is Africa, why black people?
Yeah, because it seems that because the sickle cell disease is a disease that results because of an abnormality that happens called a point mutation, because when you have there is something to do with the chromosomes. Now, when this happens, it starts at a certain point. And this looks as if it started in the African continent.
I see.
And then it started spreading elsewhere by migration, but also having other mutations happening in places like in the Middle East.
All right. Again, before we come to Leah, let's talk about symptoms. And I remember during the break I was saying, you know, I'm imagining that you had mentioned it's, you know, when a baby is born and you discover it in the early stages. But you also said people can live their entire lives and not know that they have sickle cell anemia. So what are the symptoms that someone has it?
The symptoms for sickle cell anemia depend on when you catch the patient. The newborns, they can actually present with severe anemia, and you check and they have anemia, and you find out it's actually sickle cell anemia. But you also, in the African continent, if you find a child whose hands and feet are swollen, they go to sleep and they wake up in the morning and the hands are swollen and the feet are swollen, or just one finger that is swollen and is painful, that could be sickle cell anemia. In other areas, they may think of allergy, insect bites and all that, but for an African child, make sure sickle cell anemia is on your top list. And after that, there will be pains in other bones now as they grow older. They will come with bones now, like the longer bones, like the legs and the feet and all that. But one other thing that makes us pick them up is infections. As Leah mentioned, they tend to have recurrent infections and also severe infections. So they come in with what looks like a simple pneumonia, but when you do the blood test, then you see the anemia is low, the HB is low, and then you start saying, this doesn't look normal. So
frequent infections is a sign.
The other thing that can happen in patients who they may just present, they go to sleep and they don't wake up, especially from about 2 to 8 years. A baby is fine, goes to sleep and doesn't wake up. When you wake them up, they open their eyes, but there's nothing. They're not talking, or sometimes they're just quiet, what we call a stroke. And that's something that happens in the brain. But they may also present with just pain in the abdomen, and they're just crying. And you examine them, and you think of other things like appendicitis and all that. But when you do the blood test, again, you pick up things that don't, red blood cells that don't look normal.
And at that point, when you pick it up, it can still be managed and this child can live, or is it sometimes too late?
Let me mention now in this program that children with sickle cell anemia can live. If we go to the UK now, what we call a survival rate of about 16 years, it's about 99%. If you go to the US now, to live up to 18 is about 94%. If you go to Jamaica, about around that same percentage. Now, what we are saying for sickle cell anemia, especially in this country, we can't cure it. But there is a cure. The cure really is, we will mention, we may talk about it at the end, you can do what we call a bone marrow transplant. Unfortunately, we don't have the time to go into the details.
Yeah.
But that is not what we are going to get for many patients because it's expensive. To do a bone marrow transplant now from here, if you went abroad, is about 18 to 20 million. But it can be managed. And I want to emphasize to the mothers and to the government in this country that what we need to do for sickle cell patients in this country is put up things, areas called sickle cell centers that could be either at as county centers or even at lower areas like sub-locations.
Yeah,
just giving them, making sure they attend, they are regularly checked on and given their medication that we are going to talk about.
Okay, we're almost running out of time, so we'll try and see if we can talk about the medication. You were talking about attacks. Very briefly, what was it that you were trying to say?
It is a severe pain attack that either lasts for a very short period or it can go up to 2 weeks. And that is what we call a sickle cell crisis.
Okay.
Yes.
What's been the lowest point in your journey with sickle cell?
3 years ago.
Yeah.
On that sickle cell crisis, when the doctors, I had a problem of bleeding from my uterus, and the doctors could not do anything for me because apparently the medication that they were supposed to prescribe for me were not for a person with sickle cell. So they were looking, and everything that they were trying was making the situation worse. So for me, with someone with sickle cell and bleeding and anemia, it was even a point where the doctor told me we need to do a hysterectomy. A hysterectomy is the severest kind of removal of the uterus.
Exactly.
So for me, I was, how will I be able to live that? I have ambitions to become a mother. How am I going to do that? So I decided to just forget about the health, and I went back home, and I decided to look into alternative healthcare. And I found alternative food, alternative lifestyle. I started eating foods. I changed my diet into a plant-based, naturally organic diet, which 2 weeks later reduced my bleeding, stopped it a week later, and now I have not been to the hospital for 3 years now. Daktari kind because I am not, Daktari knows that I have been a very frequent sickle cell patient, but less severe than my sister. But I've not been to the hospital in 3 years
By
now.
changing your diet?
Changing my diet.
So did you cut out meat completely?
Yes,
and that kind
I
of
cut
thing?
out meat because one of the triggers of sickle cell is acidosis. Daktari can attest this. This is where the body becomes very acidic and increases the sickling rate of your blood. So when it increases the sickling rate, the rate of crisis is more frequent.
Okay.
So if you remove meat, which is meat and animal products, which increases the acidity in your body, then you don't get these frequent attacks. You actually identify the triggers of sickle cell: dehydration, deoxygenation, low red blood cells, and acidosis and stress, physical, emotional, and psychological. When you're able to identify those triggers and be able to control them, you can easily manage this disease. And this is the information and education we want to bring to the people.
You have a lot of this information. You're very empowered, which is fantastic. But what about the rest of the country? As a warrior, as a survivor, is it a really bad situation in terms of awareness?
It is. I'm very sad to say, but it is a very bad situation, especially in the grassroots area where people don't even know what sickle cell. There's no term for sickle cell in the mother tongue. So how do you even start explaining sickle cell to someone who doesn't even know how it looks like? So now that is where we're starting for explaining what sickle cell is, the symptoms of sickle cell, how they can manage it, and telling them that it's not a witchcraft, it's not a curse, it's not from one side of the family.
And that you can live, that you can survive it.
Yeah.
So you have a foundation that raises awareness?
Yes, I have a foundation. I recently started a foundation called 10,003 Warrior Project. It is a photographic documentary that seeks to tell the story of sickle cell disease through photography. We want to photograph 10,003 faces of people living with sickle cell in Kenya to tell their stories. If someone sees a photo of someone who has lived with sickle cell for 54 years, and you're a mother who has a 2-year-old girl,
then you have hope.
You have hope. These stories actually are stories of hope for other people living with sickle cell. And it's also a way for the government, the ministry, to see that these people are a forgotten demographic in this country, and they need to set up health and support infrastructure to be able to manage the disease.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Very briefly before we take our last break.
Just a thing that I wanted to mention, that actually children with sickle cell anemia must have a balanced diet. Acidosis is going to be there, but possibly may not play a very big role, but they must have a balanced diet. And I think children, everybody believes that when you have sickle cell anemia, then you should look small and all that. That's not true. They must eat. The other thing I wanted to mention quickly, that they need support groups, and she belongs to one, and she knows I belong to another, and called Children's Sickle Cell Foundation. And what do? We just help mothers to know about how they can look after their children, and also to give them a shoulder to lean on. If you're have a child that has sickle cell anemia, you need some other mother who has a child with sickle cell anemia.
Okay, so support groups exist, and perhaps
there are many
as we wind up completely, we'll get some, a website. Very quickly, access to treatment and medication. You've mentioned earlier that you mentioned the word expensive. Is it an expensive disease to treat?
Let me tell everybody who is listening to this program, the only thing that we need is a place to look after these patients regularly. The medicine we use in sickle cell anemia are not expensive. The regular one is a drug called folic acid. You need that regularly because you're making your red blood cells, and one of the components that you need is folic acid. The other thing that we've started giving, especially from 3 months, is something called penicillin V. This is an antibiotic that can actually prevent a very common bacteria that attacks patients with sickle cell anemia. 3, to get them vaccinated. Now, one of the vaccines that we wanted for patients with sickle cell anemia was something called an pneumococcal vaccine. Luckily enough, in this country, it's now available and is freely given to children from about 6 weeks. And the other thing they need now, which is now becoming a bit more expensive, is a new drug in the market that is used all over the world where it can be bought. It's called hydroxyurea. Now, hydroxyurea looks expensive. Why? Because each capsule is about 30 shillings per capsule. But we think because the government is doing all the other things, patients with sickle cell anemia require that. But the Court of Appeal that we require in this country are centers that are specifically earmarked for sickle cell disease, established in practically every area in the country, especially in those regions that I mentioned, the coast, Nyanza, and that's why on the 19th of this month, we have what we call the World Sickle Cell Day. And
that's in a few days. That's on Friday.
Yeah, this is on Friday, and we will have a lot of activity in Homa Bay that is being headed by the
Where can people
county.
access this information about the activities or access to treatment? Is there a website? Is there a
Our website is going to be launched on the 19th. It's called 10,003 Warrior Project. So if they Google that, they'll get all the information.
10,003, the number?
10003.
10003.
Warrior Project.
Okay.
Yes.
.com.
Yes.
Children's Sickle Cell Foundation, just look for it. Children's Sickle Cell Foundation. You're going to find a lot of information, and there's a lot that we are doing. I think as we close, we'll likely talk about it just for a minute or two.
All right, we've pretty much closed. Yeah, but we're taking our final break before we come back and maybe get your final comments and wind up. Stay with us. Hussein Mohammed joins me on set in just a few moments. Welcome back. Thank you so much for staying with Monday Special. Now, almost 300,000 children around the world, and the doctor will confirm this with me in just a moment, are born with a form of sickle cell disease every year, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa, but of course also in other parts of the world. And in 2013, it resulted in 176,000 deaths, which is up from 113,000 deaths in 1990. We're talking about sickle cell disease, and in studio to just shed some light on this, we have Dr. Kennedy Charles Wafula, who is a consultant pediatrician at the Aga Khan Hospital with an interest in sickle cell disease. We also have Leah Masamo, who is living with sickle cell disease. She calls herself a warrior. I think I'll agree with that. You call yourself warriors, not survivors or patients, but warriors.
Or sicklers.
Okay, yes. Or sicklers.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much, both of you, for being here. Yeah, maybe we can just try and go back to the basics of what exactly is, and I've called it sickle cell disease, the sickle cell anemia is a form of sickle cell disease. Could you just demystify that for us?
Janet, thank you. I think I need to let the people know that when we talk about sickle cell disease, this is the umbrella. It's like a house where you find everything. But once we mention that, then we now come to what we call sickle cell anemia, which is a subset of the sickle cell disorder. If you carry it, because what is sickle cell anemia? Sickle cell anemia is a blood disorder, and I want the mothers who are listening to that to listen very carefully. It's a blood disorder that you're born with, you're inherited from your parents. Now, for you to have sickle cell anemia, your mom must be a carrier, and your dad must be a carrier. And because of that, it's not that then 20 years down the road you suddenly get sickle cell anemia. No, you're born with it. The only problem that we have is that normally when the baby is born, these babies go home and they do well for some time. And there are reasons why they do that, which we can't explain today. But there is a way of knowing your baby has sickle cell anemia before you go home. And this is what we call a neonatal screening that we currently don't do in this country.
Oh, that's currently not done
in this country.
And it should be done for all women, really, would you say? I mean, I hear what you're saying. It's unless it's inherent. But just for safety precaution, would you say that if a woman is expecting, that's something that should be tested from the word go?
Ideally, especially in this country, a mother who is expecting, you must actually know your sickle cell status before you get married. Because we'll talk about it at the end as we talk about what do we do in order to prevent the numbers becoming more. The mother must, a potential husband-to-be must know. And you don't have to wait until you say, we are getting married next week, let's go and test. Each and every student in university today, students at secondary school level should actually know their sickle cell status because this is a disease for Kenya and this is a disease for African patients.
And I'll get to that in just a moment. Is it as simple as a blood test or how complex is the testing?
The test is easy. But it's expensive. There's what we start off with so-called a sickling test, which is simple, but it doesn't tell you whether you have sickle cell anemia or the other types of sickle cell disease. Then we do a test. In this country, what we've been doing is called a hemoglobin electrophoresis, which separates this little unit that we find in the red blood cell called hemoglobin. Now, can it be done at health centers? No. It can't be done at district hospitals. It's mainly in large hospitals in this country. But ideally, it should be in every hospital where children are born. So that because of the mobiles that we have, once a baby is born, we take the blood. It takes a couple of days before we get the report back, but we can give you the report from wherever you were because we took the blood at the time the baby was born.
Leah, we'll come to you in just a moment. One or two more questions. One of them is, so say you find out that you're carrying the sickle cell and you're
an adult.
Yes, you're an adult, but you're expecting. Is it possible, is it automatic that it's passed on to the baby? And if so, is it possible that the baby can be immunized or that kind of thing when born? Or
Janet,
that kind of
let me
dynamic?
just say this, that when you're expecting, we can do tests. They are unfortunately more costly. It's called a prenatal diagnosis, PND. We don't do that ideally, but in this country, if the mother wants it, we can, but it's an expensive process, and it also has a high risk, and when you do it, you can lead to a miscarriage, but it can be done. The problem is when you do it, you've got to, there are ethical questions in there. What do you do? There are many things that can be done, but that's the question. If you do it, what do you do? But you can't immunize the baby. What are the chances if a mother is carrying a baby and she has a sickle cell gene in her body, she's a carrier, and her partner is a carrier, the chances that they have a child with sickle cell anemia is 1 in 4. The only thing that I normally tell the mothers is that this is whenever you have a pregnancy, the chance of that pregnancy, that child having sickle cell anemia is 1 in 4. But unfortunately, you can't say that let me have 4 children and one is going to have sickle cell anemia and the others will be fine.
It's hard to say.
No.
Okay.
It's a chance thing. You can actually have all the 4 children that you get having sickle cell anemia.
Okay.
Because getting a baby is really like a lottery. And the genes that come together to make this baby are also just by chance.
Yeah.
But the chances that you get a child with sickle cell anemia is 1 in 4 per pregnancy.
Let's get back to you in just a few moments. Leah, let's bring you in. Tell us a little bit about your story. You're now 26 years old.
Yes.
You've lived with this disease for 26 years.
Yes.
When were you aware that you had sickle cell anemia? How old were you when you were aware?
Well, when I was aware, I was in class 6. I was 12 years old and I was in class 6. But my parents were told that I had sickle cell when I was 3 months old.
Oh.
Because our family, 2 of my older sisters have sickle cell disease. So it was automatic that the doctor advised that they test me as well. And they found that I had sickle cell.
Yeah.
But for me to really understand and know what sickle cell is was in class 6 when I was seeing all these changes and my body is different from others. My eyes are yellow, my tummy is swollen, and I'm smaller than everyone else. I had these questions in myself, and that is when I went back to my parents and asked, what is this that makes me different, and what is this that makes me go to the hospital and in pain? So then they broke sickle cell down for me, and they told me it's a genetic disorder that deforms my red blood cells, and my red blood cells are not as those for a normal person. My red blood cells look like a crescent moon and they last 10 days. And for you, a normal person, they last 120 days.
Yeah.
That is where the anemia comes in, because you break down sickle cell red blood cells in a faster rate. So we need to, a faster rate than we are making them. So we need to really be able to continuously have a supply of red blood cells.
All right.
Yes.
Did you notice any changes? I know you said you were aware of it when you were 12.
Yes.
But growing up, did you feel more fatigued? What were some of the symptoms that you had?
Yes, I was more fatigued. I was more susceptible to infections, and I was in pain most of the time. I was in hospital most of the times. I was taking a lot of medication. My tummy was swollen, and another thing is my eyes were very jaundiced. They were very yellow.
Okay.
That is another symptom of sickle cell disease.
All right. You say that they were told when you were 3 months old.
Yes.
Were they also told that there's a likelihood you might not live long?
Yes,
Yeah.
they were. But the good thing about my parents is that they didn't tell me that.
Okay.
But they were told that I will not be able to make it beyond the age of 8.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so I found out that I was given a life gap when I went to high school. When people were surprised, oh, you have sickle cell and you're still alive. So this was a new thing for me, because I was never told by my parents that I will not live beyond a certain age. So I was told, you guys are not supposed to live beyond the age of 16. I was like, who said that? That is when I actually found out about the life gap. And I'm very, very glad that my parents didn't mention this, because I would be living in fear and waiting for the day when my life ends.
And you said you have 2 older sisters who also have it?
Yes.
They're alive and well?
No, unfortunately, my elder sister passed away with sickle cell.
Okay.
But my older sister is the one who I follow.
Okay.
And she has been able to live. She is 28, and she has a young baby boy who's 2 years old.
And does he have?
No, he doesn't have. He doesn't have. And that's another misconception we were trying to debunk, because you're told that if you have sickle cell, you cannot have a family. Your chances of having a family are limited, 0. So when something like this happens, it's a question whether are the things that people know about sickle cell real, or are they just making it up as they go? So if you're having someone grow to the age of 26, and someone has given birth to a child with sickle cell disease, don't we have a platform to meet and tell them this is how you can be able to manage sickle cell, and this is how you can be able to live a normal life?
Yeah.
It is not a hopeless situation.
Okay.
Yes.
I'll come back to you just now, Doctor. I want to ask you how you have managed to live with it. What kind of lifestyle choices did you have to make very early on to be able to live until, 26?
Well, it is not a coincidence. Dr. here was my doctor.
Oh, really?
For a very long time.
I didn't know that.
Yes, for a very long time. But I'm going back to my parents, because they were very hopeful that our disease is manageable. So they went all over. They were researching and medication that builds the blood components that we are lacking, like red blood cells and things that rehydrate our cells, things that oxygenate our blood. That is what we need. So borrowing from that, I've been able to manage my sickle cell using diet. Food, vegetables, fruits, like nutrition. 3 years ago, I got a very, very bad crisis. A crisis is a sickle cell attack that leaves you in pain and leaves you... Doctor, you can explain this better.
But before, I think what we can
Yes.
do, we'll pick up on
Yes.
that, managing the lifestyle. We
Yes.
have to take a short break.
Yes.
We'll pick up on managing lifestyle as well as medication and access to that medication in just a few moments. Don't forget to, tweet using the hashtag Monday Special KE. Send in your questions if you have any. Text us on 22422. Leave your name and location. We'll be right back on Monday Special.